Presenting Poetry, Unit 1, Summative. So in this presentation, I will be analyzing two different poems, one from the Victorian era, which is Requie's Cat by Oscar Wilde, and one from the Victorian era, A Dream Within a Dream by Edgar Allan Poe. So, Oscar Wilde's life. Oscar Wilde was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1854. His father was a surgeon and his mother was a poet a skilled linguist who brought appreciation of art, culture, and literature into their lives. Oscar had two siblings, Willie and Isola, who died in 1866, which we will elaborate later on. He was quite serious about his education, having been a bookish child, and he had a big love of Greek and Roman studies that lasted well into his literary success period. He was awarded a scholarship at both Trinity College and Oxford universities, where his professors influenced him greatly. Wilde made a large part of his money presenting lectures and growing his fame with his odd character and extravagant style. He got married to Constance Lloyd and had two children, Cyril and Vivian. And around the same time, he worked as an editor, wrote children's stories, poems, and a novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. And around that same time as well, Wilde started having a careless affair with the son of the Marquis of Queensberry, Lord Alfred Douglas, in 1891. Queensberry was not happy about this affair, and Wilde sued him for libel because of a note that he left, which he found very offensive, but it didn't turn out in his favor because Wilde was sent to prison for 2 years for gross indecency. And that regime was hard on him, and once he got out, he was in exile, his family not talking to him, and they changed their last name. And in the end, he died of meningitis in 1900 while still in exile in France. So on the left is a picture of Oscar Wilde and Lord Alfred Douglas, nicknamed Bosie, and on the right is Oscar Wilde. So this is the poem Requie's Cat. It was written in 1881, or rather published in 1881, and it is about his sister that died. And on the bottom right, the photo is of her tombstone. It's Isola Wilde. So analysis. So the poem is about the sadness and the heartbreak that Oscar Wilde's sister, Isola, caused by her death when she died only at 10 years old of meningitis. And this can be seen through the verse alone, I vex my heart alone, how Wilde is suffering and grieving by himself, and Isola is at peace. She hardly knew she was a woman. She died too young. And the form is that Requie's Cat is composed of 5 different quatrains. So line 1 and 3 have 6 syllables, whilst lines 2 and 4 have 4 syllables. So it has a rhyming scheme of A, B, A, B, and is also written in iambic pentameter. So for the diction and the syntax, so this poem was written in a formal and poetic diction. It contains sophisticated language as well as lyrical words that are used to create a harmonious sound set to a beat and a rhyme. So for example, she that was young and fair has a complicated syntax, and it's descriptive and doesn't use any colloquial wording. So it also contains enjambments, which means that each sentence continues without a pause beyond the end of a verse. So each sentence continues, each verse continues, and many commas are used. So in poetic devices, Oscar Wilde uses many poetic devices to convey the message of the poem, such as symbolism. So in the verse, Lily like white as snow, Isola is compared to a flower demonstrating her beauty, as well as being compared to snow, showing her to be pure and innocent. And another example is idioms. So all her bright golden hair tarnished with rust. So that means her hair is not literally tarnished with rust. It means her hair is being degraded by the surrounding elements as she's decomposing. And for the style, Oscar Wilde writes his poem in a simplistic and easy-to-read manner. He excelled in the use of imagery and other forms of literary devices to describe situations and people in the poems. So Wilde's poems are usually much longer and more detailed than Requie's Cat. So like, for example, after he was in prison, Wilde wrote The Ballad of Reading Gaol, and that is made up of 7 parts and is over 20 pages long. So the period that it represents is the Victorian era. So it was between the years 1837 to 1901 during the reign of the Queen of Victoria. So Victorian poetry was less idealized than the Romantics, so death was death, and there's nothing that they could change about that. So, for example, Oscar Wilde wrote, "All her bright golden hair tarnished with rust." He wrote this death realistically, mentioning her rotting away instead of simply her beauty in death, as the Romantics would say. Also, due to the Industrial Revolution, there was an increase in population, which meant more diseases, death, slums, etc. The entire premise of the poem is the death of Wilde's young sister, Isola Wilde. She that was young and fair, fallen to dust. She died too young from a disease, only at 10 years old, and the author is still hurting. So Requie's Cat by Oscar Wilde represents the Victorian era very well, incorporating many themes that were popular then, as well as the context of composition in which it was written, so the death of his sister. So these themes include but are not limited to pessimism, realism, skepticism, morality, and sentimentality. So with the critical comments, Oscar Wilde is mostly remembered for his wit and personality rather than his writing. He's become even more popular for being a political symbol. He's known as the most famous victim of the criminalization of homosexuality. So basically, homosexual and bisexual actors were sure to look for the roles in Wilde's plays and his books, and they became even more popular during the legal battle of the Sexual Offenses Act in 1967, when they finally decriminalized homosexuality. He became so popular after he died that a glass case had to be placed around his grave because of the amounts of lipstick prints that were being left on it, on his tombstone, out of all the adoration that he got. And so for my personal appreciation, I essentially chose Requie's Cat for its interesting title and short length. So the title was very interesting because it was a word that I had never seen before, and I had to know what it meant and the context in which it was written. So this poem, it was a good read. The theme of the poem was quite interesting and easily understood because of the simple vocabulary without any complicated words. And some other works of Oscar Wilde are The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is a novel, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, which is his longest poem, The Importance of Being Earnest, a play, and The Happy Prince, which I believe is children's stories. So now for the romantic author that I chose was Edgar Allan Poe, and his life was that Edgar Allan Poe was born in Massachusetts, USA in 1809. His parents were both actors and died when he was 3 years old. So that left him to be fostered by the Allens, but they never actually went through with the adoption. And Poe wasn't very serious about his education. He attended Virginia University, but left due to his unpaid gambling debts. And because of his bad relationship with his parents, he enlisted into the army in 1827, because he left home as soon as he could. And then he later on entered into West Point Academy, but he had to leave again because he got no financial support. And then over the course of the next 10 years, Poe was an editor for many literary journals. He married his 13-year-old cousin in 1836, and he established himself as a writer, poet, and an editor. But after Virginia's death in 1847 of tuberculosis, just like his mother, I believe, Poe suffered from severe depression and alcoholism even more than he had before, so it worsened, and he moved to the South to reconnect with old friends, but he died 2 years later of unknown causes in a ditch. Some believe it was due to his alcoholism or heart disease, and no one really knows if he died in a ditch or it was in a hospital, and it will never be known. So on the left is Edgar Allan Poe, and on the right is a picture of, well, not a picture, but more of a drawing of his wife, Virginia Eliza Clem. And so this is the poem, A Dream Within a Dream, and it was written in 1849. So basically, for the topic and the tone, the poem, A Dream Within a Dream, it questions reality and human existence. So time passes, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. Life is so short, but it goes by so fast, just like in the verse how Poe writes, "How few, yet how they creep. The tone of Poe's poem is depressing. He's mourning the loss of a loved one, his wife, because she just passed when he had written this poem. How life is slipping away from him, like grains of sand, which is a metaphor compared in the poem. A Dream Within a Dream has an open form, having only 2 stanzas. The first only has 11 verses, and the second has 12 verses. It's written iambic trimeter, for the most part, but in lines 1, 2, and 24, Poe wrote them in an anapes, so it was 2 different meters that he used in the poem. And for the diction and the syntax, the poem was written in more of a formal manner with sophisticated language. For example, in the verse, "You are not wrong, who deem," is written with no contractions at all, no colloquialisms. Like "your" and "deem" is used instead of another word such as regard or consider. Some poetic devices that Poe uses, he uses them to convey the hidden meaning, like personification. In the verse he says, "Yet if hope has flown away," Poe gives hope, which is a feeling and not an object, the human ability to fly. Or another one is repetition, A Dream Within a Dream. The title is repeated twice throughout the poem, and it is at the end of each stanza. So this literary device is used to evidently portray the main theme of the poem. Edgar Allan Poe wrote his poems on the side of the dark romanticism. This is his style. However, A Dream Within a Dream does not follow under this subgenre. Poe's life revolved around the tragedies and death, with his parents dying when he was young and his wife later on. These themes show through his writing as a tortured soul who fought alcoholism and was obsessed with violence and death. Edgar Allan Poe had a very unique style of writing, dark, dramatic, and mysterious. So how this poem represents is the literary period which it was written in. So the Romantics used many elements of nature as a big part of the inspiration. Poe uses nature to describe the main theme. So in the verse, "Grains of the golden sand" and "one of the pitiless waves," these verses use sand and waves as a metaphor for life. The poem was written during the same time Poe's alcoholism started to affect his life, and the main theme is losing the grasp on reality, and Poe is doing just so. So his wife had just passed away, and his alcoholism increased more, and that represents itself in the poem. Yeah, so in the first stanza, it represents the loss of his wife, Virginia. In the verse, "and in parting from you now," caused him to self-destruct, which is another theme, leading to his alcoholism, and he merely died months after this poem's publication. It is more of a mental picture. It doesn't have a specific setting. It's a dream state or delusion. He can't tell what's real once he loses his love and begins to question his reality, standing on a sort of beach, but the beach is metaphorical. And for the critical comment, Edgar Allan Poe was one of the first American authors, actually, to live a life off of writing alone. Most authors at the time never relied on writing as a living. They would stay up all hours of the night or did during their spare time. He showed them that writing was a lifestyle, not just a hobby. The way that Poe died intensified his popularity, because it's like how in one of his stories, The Mysterious Ways, and he died of unknown causes, leading everyone to speculate how he died and what really happened, and that increased his fame as well. And my personal appreciation was that the reason why I chose A Dream Within a Dream was because I was already familiar with some Edgar Allan Poe's work, but I chose specifically this one because it had an intriguing title. It's unlike any of his other poems. The theme is more easily found, perhaps because it's one of his shorter poems. However, I found that I didn't enjoy the use of 2 different meters instead of keeping it the same rhythm through the poem, because he used an anapes and a trimeter. It made it harder to understand a little bit. It made it a little bit harder to understand, but overall, it was an excellent poem with great themes and very interesting metaphors. Some of his other works include The Raven, which is a poem, Annabelle, which is another poem, and 2 short stories, which is The Cask of Amontillado and The Telltale Heart, which I have all read in the past. And compared between the Romantics and the Victorians, so both poems share some main themes, such as death and grieving, but since they're from different literary eras, the authors wrote the poems differently. For example, in Requie's Cat, Oscar Wilde doesn't mention God at all, but in A Dream Within a Dream, Edgar Allan Poe mentions it multiple times with his spirituality and everything. And in the bibliography, this is just for the images. For the sources of websites, they are written in each separate document in which the information was found.